to the next level. We can't get back there, but then what are the options? And I will be happy to hear from this meeting. That's why my paper is an evolving situation. And conversion of raw materials. Again, we have these challenges of extremes of we must add value. To what end? Gone are the days when you would add value A to Z. You don't make a pen. And I will be giving an illustration of what Trump has discovered when he said, I want to make vehicles in America. He had to suspend the tariff when he realized vehicles are not made in America. They are only finalized in America. Your phone is not made in America. The design was in Silicon Valley. The manufacturing was in China. But the transistors came in from Taiwan. The minerals came from Congo. So as part of that network, you want to say, where do I position myself? For us who grew up in the era of hunting and gathering, whenever an antelope would be killed, there was a formula for sharing it. Who saw it first? Who speared it first? Who brought the dogs? Who brought the net? Now, that is how you shared. Now, unfortunately for people, when a cob was caught in my compound, my dogs are the ones that saw it first. So I got a thigh. And then my herdsman was the first to catch it and then shouted, come and help. We brought another thigh. And then I was the first on the scene to help. There were no spears, but we brought a knife and cut off the head. I got another thigh. Now the rest of the people said, what do we take? This is really the distribution of those. You want to address some of these issues. And Mr. Museveni illustrates this and says the value addition in the pre-colonial era was biased against the Africans. They dealt in the raw materials. You end with the cotton ginning. But even the cotton ginning was being done by Ugandans of Asian origin. So the 10% that was remaining in Uganda, only about 3% was going to the farmers. Maybe that's why there was kiboko. They could not see the value. But we also saw that in the post-colonial era, during the coffee marketing board era, that farmers were getting only 30% of the international price of coffee. But after liberalization, that jumped to 70%. So today, kiboko coffee is 6,000 shillings. Kase is 12 to 15,000 shillings. Those farmers are motivated. And I know there are people here who never thought they would be coffee farmers. But today they are planted. So price incentives do matter. And that was at the heart of Mr. Museveni's liberalization. Liberalize. The most important person in the early 80s in this economy was the chairman of Coffee Marketing Board. Not even the governor of the central bank. Because they decided how many dollars to keep and how many dollars to give to the central bank. No wonder Oito Joko was the chairman. So if we had continued along that route, you know who the chairman of CMB would be. But thank God to liberalization, we don't even need a chairman. There are so many chairmen out there making their own decisions and doing the financing. And the worst part of that, the coffee farmers were not being paid in time, leave alone being paid very little value. So while we challenge liberalization, while we challenge privatization, there were benefits that the economic principles we are looking for, and you may have your opinion, which is okay, but don't miss out the economic principles that created those policies. So Mr. Museveni highlights the wealth creation process of specialization and then exchange. And then finally the selfish interest of the producers. I still have issues with him when he says we must add the value to the finality. And then sometimes we come up with distortionary policies. Come July 1st, we are going to have a tax on export of raw hides. I'm not sure there is a tannery somewhere which will process Uganda's hides yet. Now, while the ambition in the military, my generals are here, they say, get the intention of the commander and then see how to implement it. But when the commander comes to begin directing the lower generals and the captains on how to implement his decision, you have a problem. You just tell us your intention. If the intention is to capture Kampala, we are going to come and camp in Katonga for 2 months. We are mobilizing, but we know what you told us to do. So really, if we want to add value, sometimes you don't want to go hand-picking who should and how it should be done. You give us the intention, let these economists come back to you within a month. If they don't, you have the privilege to sack them and replace the team. So I would wish to see Museveni take that trend, ask people, give me a brief, give me a paper, and I have seen people seated in this room who literally did that. The president will give a direction. I have with me a paper on privatization of PAD. the privatization and divestiture unit, which listed which companies government should retain 100%, which companies should we sell but retain majority, 51%, which company should we sell and retain minority, 49%, and which one should we completely sell off. But that was informed by technical. The president gave the high-level command instruction. Then Pelos went and crunched numbers. And this week I met one of the young scholars who was involved in that to say, when we liberalize, what stress will be on this company and will it survive the one we intend to retain? So there was academic and intellectual input, but today we don't see that. We all wake up to something and it has already been done. So how do we get back that conversation? And I want to take this opportunity to announce that on the 10th of June, the Uganda Economics Association, the MOBS Economic Forum, and Economic Policy Research Center, we want to invite you to Africana. 10th of June, please take note, at 2 p.m. Let these economists and policy makers sit and have discussions. Why 10th of June? We will be sitting in between two important events in the economic history of the year. The State of the Nation will have been given. The budget will be 2 days away. So what a better time for economists to discuss and inform those policy processes. And that, I think, is one of the things we are missing out today. So people have to take decisions, but maybe we have not informed them on how these things should be done. So the era of 62 to 86 really had a lot of political turmoil. There were a lot of decisions made, and I want to insist that some of the decisions made by politicians were wrong, but there is no politician who makes a decision to kill the economy. They don't come out and say, let me take this decision, nationalize the land so that the economy dies. At that point, they believe that is the best, and they take it. Now, our duty as academicians is to say, wait a minute, these are the issues. Now, in our absence, decisions were made. It was the belief that the state-owned enterprises must be established. The state must own things. So the establishment of my friend UDC is here, and many others that were there at the time. Foods and beverages. Can you imagine foods and beverages today? What would it be doing? Can it compete with capital shoppers? It would be lining up for the minister to give it a subsidy and certain other grants. So those are the issues that we saw. There was an effort for market expansion, and the president has been into that, creating and recreating the East African community, which had collapsed during that period. You had the oil crisis of the early 70s, and the shoot up in the debt that distorted a number of these countries. During the Botte's second regime, certain policies were taken to revive the economy, and the period ending 1983 to reduce inflation, and it came down from 100 to 30% during that period. But there were quite a number that the recovery was short-lived, because after 1984, these generals had intensified the pressure on the military, and the military began guzzling the resources. Right, Honorable Mao, you're welcome. We recognize your trenches that you are in, but this is also another trench that you should be in, because some of the things we are talking about here deal with your sector of the judiciary. 1984-85, the economy went back down because certain key productive areas of the country had been captured by the NRA. So they were no longer feeding into the economy. In 85, you had the whole of Fort Portal belonging to another government. Fred Muhumza, you see me here, I left school in July 1985. I was in senior 3. By the time the school opened, I was in another regime, so I could not go back to school. Until mid-1986, now I'm in senior 4. So I never did promotion exams to senior 4. But now I had 4 months literally to sit for my A-level, but also to complete senior 3. And while I tried to do that, there was another insurgency and disruption, and the school was closed for 3 other months. So I came back a month to UNEB. Now, those were serious disruptions of an economic and social nature. But here we are. So those were the declines that the civil war and the military coup of July 27th July 1985, the economy had literally declined significantly by the time Isam 7 comes in. So 86, when he came in, we want to assess the transition, and we've agreed with the team that we'll have 6 guiding questions. One, what was resolved and has not reemerged since 1986? What did we solve? The second question that is going to guide us is what was resolved but has come back. The third question is what was never resolved. In other words, it has persisted throughout the 40 years. We still have it. The fourth question, what is emerging? It wasn't there. Now Trump is in the house. Wars are in the house. Ukraine has been invaded. What has emerged that was not there? Number 5 is what was not done, possibly due to foresight, or we did not prioritize it. And the final question is what should we do to sustain the modernization of the economy? To answer those questions, we get back and look into what is Museveni's ideological underpinning. One is rationality, evidence-based decision making. And as I've said, when the evidence is not on the table, but he still has to make a decision, he will make a decision. Now, to resolve that challenge of possibly a decision that was not informed by evidence, but it had to be made, Professor Muterile, rest in peace, created an institution called the Economic Policy Research Center. And some of us have emerged through there. What was the tagline? Policy-oriented research. Don't go to research how many angels dance on a pin. I have policy issues. So the Economic Policy Research Center, I'm talking about institutions and discussions for raising evidence, was about to say, what decision did you make? Did we give you the information? If we didn't, we are going to research and bring it. So please have time to review. And for that purpose, the chairperson of the Economic Policy Research Center is the PSST himself. He determines what should be done there. And was a project of the Ministry of Finance, still remains a project of the Ministry of Finance. Some of us worked there diligently for years until when I was told, you are staying too far away in Makerere, the problems are right in the Ministry of Finance. So they brought me in there as an advisor to permanently sit in the Ministry of Finance, but as an ambassador. I was not a staff. I remained a staff of EPRC, but on secondment. And what a glorious 8 years they were to learn from the decision makers. But the whole point is evidence, decision making, because Museveni is rational. Museveni is also reasonable. Whenever you would come back and say, we think, Your Excellency, the decision you took based on the evidence now was not the right one. Or it was right, but we have a better option. Commander-in-Chief, you give him options. You don't say jump from A to B. You say there was A, we have evaluated it, but we have these other options. So Museveni is reasonable. Many times I hear people say orders from above. I have been in that space. I know you can receive an order from above. Say, sir, I have heard you. Give us 2 weeks, we'll be back. And if you're back in 2 weeks with options, the story changes. And that is how it has been. That is one of the things that we would want to be. So Museveni is reasonable. When you provide the context, he's able to listen. Realism, what is the reality on the ground? I think these are traits he also picked as a military man, because you don't just go through a swamp or go to attack when you do not have sufficient men. We know the guerrilla warfare, sometimes you attack not to keep the territory. You only attack to disrupt, show the enemy I'm here, carry away their weapons and leave this territory. Later on, he began to occupy and retain territories. But in the early stages, it was attack, do whatever you want to do and leave. So that is being realistic. Then he's also adaptable, as I've said, flexibility in implementation of issues, logic must be followed, and then creativity. Those are key attributes, and then innovation of Mr. Museveni as he ran through. So as we move into the space, it's worth noting, as I've said, regimes do not consciously come out to destroy whatever is happening. The size of the economy, as we've said, had shrunk. Some people say by the time Museveni came in, GDP was 1.26 billion. Others say it was 3.6, but we can forgive ourselves. The data at that point was not clear. But all we know, it was very small. That's the conclusion from this. 60% of households had retreated into subsistence. Salt was a preserve of the rich. One time during the Amin era, my father turned up with a 60-kilogram bag of sugar. And I'm like, what has happened? But being a district education officer, maybe they came and gave the district officials. But he had to keep it by his bedside because being small boys who had never seen sugar, we found how to make holes and keep licking it until mommy finds some sugar on your lips and you know what you're headed for. But those were days of scarcity. And how do you deal with those? That is what Museveni inherited, hyperinflation. The transport network had collapsed. And I remember a case when I had to come from Bushenyi to Kampala on a truck loaded with coffee. We spent 2 days to reach Kampala. That was the economy that was inherited. So while you want to stabilize the security, you also want to restore the infrastructure. And there were others manufacturing, literally many of them had closed down, or they were operating at very low capacity. Quite a number of them were below 5%. We still have factories, as I said, what has persisted, that are operating at 30% and below. And in Kayip, we also have factories that are not working. The equipment like haulers, like coolers for milk, that are literally not working. So some things have persisted. And we need to look into how do we resolve that. External debt, now we have also added domestic debt. If you look at the Charter for Fiscal Responsibilities by the Ministry of Finance, debt service interest payment is not supposed to go beyond 12% of our domestic revenues. The report of Parliament that approved the budget for 2025-26 indicates that is at 25%. Now, that costs you money that you should have put in services. So we need to answer the debt question. So guided by the 10-point program the president went through, and it were the 10 points, I just highlighted the critical 4 for purposes of this presentation. One was restoration of democracy and security, elimination of corruption and misuse of power, pursuit of mixed economy strategy, and then building an independent, integrated, self-sustaining national economy. As we've said, ideologically, Museveni was ready to switch from one side to another to make sure you find what works. But what works needed to be informed by candid discussions and not just hearsay. So his move to the right, you literally have about $22-25 million as reserves in the central bank, supporting only 2 weeks of imports. Professor Surma here will testify the dilemma you have. When you want to import drugs, you want to import fuel, you want to import bullets, you want to bring in food, what do? And the only donor willing to give you that money is saying, do the following. We call those DPI, Development Policy Loans, DPLs. The loan is based on you reforming your development policies. But you are also in need, and their need. So for that time, you found programs like Essential Drugs Program. We know there are people with diabetes, there are people with cancer, but at this point, we don't have money for everybody. Can we find an essential drugs program? That is realism, that is rationalism, that's logical. Because we know non-communicable diseases can be very expensive to treat. But thank God, 40 years down the road, we now have some options. Even if they are not in Mulago, they are available in the market, you can find them. That is part of the journey that we need to recognize. Because the dilemmas of Mulago, ladies and gentlemen, are not by Mulago itself. They are bigger ecosystem, because if almost 50% of your budget is being taken by debt, what is left to do roads? What is left to do education? What is left to do health? What is left to do security? We are back to those levels where the budgets may be bigger, but the needs are even bigger, and we're back to those levels of rationalizing budgets by priorities. And Honorable Mouse, people are saying pay us even in retirement. So what do? We one who these days will end up paying more judges in retirement than the ones in practice. So we are proposing to follow those judges in retirement. Say, can you still read and write a ruling for us, since we are paying you? But that's another conversation. But it's part of the evidence we need to put on the table, because some things we can't change, but there is room for leveraging. So there was economic recovery program. Most people remember 2 zeros were cut off and 30% was taken. But what was the gist? What was the economic policy principle that was being followed in those aspects? You had inflation. You wanted to change the currency. You wanted to raise some revenue as well to support the same people. There was a coffee stabilization tax. We all remember. 1994, many people may not remember that. But because of the spike in the coffee prices, there was an introduction of coffee stabilization, mainly to protect the households themselves, who are now going to have surplus and they would spend it on things that are not useful to them, being informed by the permanent income hypothesis that I don't want to get into. But also government realized if somebody has been getting $1-2 on coffee, now the price of coffee is 5. Why don't I take a 1.5 and he gets 3.5? We share the windfall. So that policy enabled government to realize some revenue, because at that point the revenue to GDP was less than 4%. And we needed money to do the roads, which were also helping the coffee to go through. These were really the principles that informed some of these decisions. Like them or hate them, there was an economic logic to these aspects. But also wanted to curb inflation. If farmers were going to get all that money, they were going to cause inflation because of increased money supply. So inflation was being curbed from various options. Today, we seem to have only interest rates, which may not be the right way to go, because it kills off further investment. We've got to do those trade-offs. But we knew that these reforms had gainers and losers, and for that, the responsive Museveni logically said, can we set up a PAPSCA? How many remember PAPSCA? So we knew there were people who are going to be affected by programs of social alleviation, and they needed support. That is the responsive and reactive Museveni that we saw. Now, maybe there are people suffering today, and I see them every other day. Which academic has come up to say this is how we can support the border borders and the women on the streets who are facing hardships? If we took that paper, wouldn't we get some policy proposals? At the Makerere University Business Economic Forum, we are doing a study on border borders. Some of you hate them. You dare remove border borders from Kampala, the city will collapse. Because some of you, they are the ones who take your children. They are the ones you call to take the bunch of banana home. You don't even know where the school of that child is, but somebody picks the child and takes them back. And for that, you concentrate on your desk. Because not all of us are privileged like a deputy governor to have a driver and a car. But your child needs to be picked. But I'm going to be meeting until 9 p.m. So what happens? You call a border. You have dogs at home, they need meat, they just call you at 7, the meat is finished. You call a butcher, the meat is delivered. So borders are not just a nuisance. They are part and parcel of the Kampala system. The study is about market resilience built by the American model of how flexible and resilient are livelihoods. Each one of us, our livelihoods are part and parcel of that. You can now order CJ, and Museveni literally allowed us to learn from COVID, when some of these logistical networks were allowed to continue moving on. So responsiveness created PAPSCA. There were policies for expenditure reduction. How do we reduce government spending? Retrenchment, civil service was scaled down. Demobilization of the soldiers. Mr. Museveni was convinced, now you have finished the war, some of these soldiers can go home. And the money was provided to reintegrate them into society. Now, there are different records. How many were sent home? But I think I've seen one of the president's letters indicating 60,000 soldiers were sent home. And the convincing fact was, Mr. President, when we send off these peasants who you trained to fight, we will save enough money and invest in education. Now, in the future, when you want to recruit, you will be able to find senior 4 graduates. Those are better in the army than these peasants you are having today. So it was a win-win. And indeed, you can see the military we have, some of them are some of the best educated individuals. So some of these programs were futuristic, but you had to bring the evidence. I'm laying off this, what is my benefit? So I raised 3, or rather 9 things that Mr. Museveni put in his remarks at Igongo. I will quickly run them through, because he said, this is what I set out to do in 1986. Number 1, restore security of persons and property. And with security, you will quarrel with Mr. Museveni if you don't speak the right thing, because that is his core. Security of person and security of property. We know some things have persisted. Security of property, the land grabbing is really a threat to property of individuals. I have my life, but somebody has grabbed my land. Now my life also is endangered because my livelihood is distorted. Now, some people are losing their property because of economic policies, bank foreclosures, that the economy is not able to guarantee and secure personal property. So while security is there, my personal property going away, then I have a vulnerability that needs to be addressed by government. These are things that have persisted. A friend of mine told me on Sunday, the priest emphasized many things but said, twafuna emirembe naye kati emirembe gitumazeeko emirembe. Now translate for your neighbor if they have not understood, especially if they have not laughed, then that means they have not understood. It's possible. Fine, I'm alive, but my land has been taken. I'm alive, but diseases are taking me. How do I secure my personal life property as well? These are things that have persisted over the 40 years. So in practice, rationality and the use of evidence in decision making should not compromise or be compromised by emotional and political choices. But we know the choice makers are politicians and they have goals. So you need to listen to them. What is it that they want to meet politically, and how do we meet each other halfway? Do we create other elements of PAPSCA as the policies move on? So the restoration, the demobilization was able to inform and save some monies which went into the social sector. To give money to Mulago, something else must go away. Again, I learned from Professor Mutebire about what we call counter-cyclical policies. If something is going up, something else must go down. So if the security budget must increase, some other budget must go down. If you want to increase funding to social services, you need to cut somewhere. And we have a bloated civil service. We need to reduce the civil service. There is a proposal. Genuinely, we want to increase the salaries for civil servants. And it happened in the 80s. They were increased by a very good percentage. But you don't increase before you scale down the numbers. If something is going up, another thing must go down. Can we do an Elon Musk email to each of the civil servants to give us 5 bullets of what you do in office? Anybody who fails to raise 5 bullets of what they do, they don't know what they are doing. So why are we paying them? As they have said, if you pretend to pay, people will pretend to work. But what do you do? And that can be a challenge. So we need to first of all reform and restructure the civil service and then increase the pay. The savings from those who go home, we shall have a PAPSCA for them. We shall have a recovery strategy for them. But the economy cannot move with the current spending going by the borrowing levels. Number 2 was liberalization and privatization, which was intended to create space for investors. In the private sector, remember they had the ideology, they had the greed like Adam Smith made to make more money. They were not like employees of government who were happy with their salary, while the companies were not doing any production. So liberalization had those aspects of creating a space for actors who would bring in money, bring in new ideas, but also competition drives you to move to the next level. I won't be mentioning, the other day I ordered for food and paid for it, but because it's a monopoly setting, the kind of service I received was the worst. What if there was competition? You would get better. I'm sure Mestil here is making sure we are all comfortable, because if we are not, we will choose another place from Musevenomics 2026. But they want to say, can you make a partnership here? Can you stay with us? You are eating, are you okay? But there are people you come and sit and they are not bothered whether you are there. It's as if a cockroach has come into the restaurant. Liberalization was to sort out some of these. And as we will see, the liberalization of the coffee sector, it did not remove the cooperatives. They were supposed to compete. And some of the first entities to register in that space were actually cooperatives. And they have persisted with all the struggles. So it's not that it was intended to kill the cooperative culture, it was intended to bring in the culture. Ladies and gentlemen, coffee is a cash-based product. For you to carry away my bag, I need my money now. How do you finance that coffee? And by straight line calculation, that is 12 billion every day going to the farming households. If you calculate how much kiboko is produced in a year, divide it by 365, it's 12 billion every day that goes to the households. Where is that money coming from? You want to be looking into those considerations. So the privatization, as we've said, one, to bring in the private sector, but also to cut the hemorrhage on the government budget. Number 3, diversification of the economy, with a special focus on increasing export revenues. We have information Uganda's export revenues at the time, 95% was coming from coffee. So there was a program of non-traditional exports. Honorable Victoria is here. It was largely sitting in her docket as Minister of Agriculture. How do we export fish, flowers, beans, maize? And who badly needed the dollars? Bank of Uganda. So it was not a preserve of the Minister of Agriculture. There was an agricultural policy secretariat inside Bank of Uganda to provide technical guidance on what should the dollar rate be, what should the interest rate be. Today I hear some of these things are different. I'm looking forward when we have a policy secretariat in Bank of Uganda, not a credit facility. So Bank of Uganda should not be running credit. That is not your space. You run policy, you have banks you are regulating, let them run the credit. So what is it doing there? These are ideas that when you liberalize, put institutions in place, let's monitor them, let's evaluate them. Number 4, and so this program of increasing the non-traditional exports, we saw quite a lot of thrust coming through from that space. The fishing factories around Lake Victoria employed 38,000 people by around 2020 in the 20s and created quite enough money for us. Coffee liberalization has taken us from 2.1 million bags in 1986 to now more than 8 million bags. Number 4 was the increase of access to markets, and Mr. Museveni has been working on that argument. How do we integrate and bring in other markets? But we're saying it's not about the East African market. We are all too poor. 400 million poor people don't make a market. You need to venture into those other markets. You need to venture into other value chains. And that's why the Chinese are quarreling with Americans, because they knew they had 1 billion people who were poor. So they ventured to tap the American and the European markets. So what is our strategy on export-led growth? We still have Kenya, South Sudan, and DRC as our biggest export destinations. How do we tap into these other bigger markets? But also, it's not value addition must be done in Uganda, and then we export finally refined and value-added products. Gone are the days for that. As I've said, one of the things that impressed me is a piston is just a small component, but a very vital component of a motor vehicle engine. The piston. That's where the power is. That's why the power is generated. So you don't want to get it wrong by the piston. Museveni's learnings from Adam Smith said you specialize. So it's generated. So you don't want to get it wrong by the piston. Museveni's learnings from... Here is a story that said I put tariffs on Mexico and Canada. People raised evidence and put it to him that, Mr. President, the powder of the aluminium that makes the piston begins in Tennessee. Just crushing the metal to make the powder is in Tennessee. Then the powder is turned into rods in Pennsylvania. You're still in the US. Once the rods are done, they are sent to Canada for polishing. And from Canada, they are sent to Mexico to be turned into pistons, which pistons are then sent to Michigan to be inserted into the engine. Trump said, I've suspended the sanctions, the tariffs, for another 90 days. I'm sure they are not coming back. But that's the nature of value addition. So how do we go about value addition agenda? I think there we still need to raise the evidence to have discussions with ourselves, building those institutions and making the decisions. China cut interest rates last week. From what to what, to what, to what, to what, to... Interest rates in China were too high at 1.5. What are they in Uganda? Can you compete? Do you think free land in Namanga will help you overcome the Chinese products? You're literally hemmed in. No political talk, no military solution would solve that. But the question is, how can Ugandans tap into global, cheap capital sources? Partnerships. And we need to have these conversations. We are not going to capitalize UDB and defeat the Chinese. So the policy options need to be thinking differently. As I've said, Museveni is adaptive, Museveni is realistic, Museveni is rational. Number 5, restoration of infrastructure. I've already mentioned the dilapidated state of roads. We have increased the tarmac roads to beyond 5,000 to 6,000. Now we have a problem of maintenance. They are breaking down and we can't find the money. These are things we are saying they are remerging. They have not persisted, but they are remerging. And these are adding to cost of doing business. So whether you have free land in an industrial park, this cost will cost you. The bank charge will cost you. And at the end of the day, you can't compete globally. And Bank of Uganda data on the real effective exchange rate indicates we have need to be informed differently so that we can get back. The power sector, we are making it unsustainable. And as I've said, no politician sets out to make a decision to kill the economy. You have a genuine concern, you have listened to your manufacturers and you've said you will use electricity. And China wisely sank $1.3 trillion in the Belt and Road Initiative to make sure their goods reach every corner of the world. So those are the dynamics. Those are the emerging issues. So we cannot set policies like we did 40 years ago. We need to rethink. We need to bring in the new realities that are on the table. Human capital development was essential. The liberalization of universities, education, has increased enrollment. Over 260,000 are now in universities. At the dawn of Mr. Museveni, it was less than 7,000 people in university, because admission was determined by how many beds are in Makerere. Not even the lecture rooms or the lecturers. How many beds? And I remember that conversation. If somebody was in Makerere High, he's already on the fence of Makerere. He had a bed there. Can't he sleep there and come and study? That was the beginning of liberalization and privatization of higher level education. The evidence is with us. So some of these policies were very clearly marked to solve some problems. Number 7 is the leadership. And the president really highlights focused leadership is missing. The leaders have not informed the people. The leaders have not done the monitoring. So certain people have done their own things, especially at the technical level. And the examples amidst us, a few years back, we said every district will get 1 billion for road construction. I like the honorable member of parliament. I won't mention him. But he gave me his story. He went and asked, how are we spending the billion? The district officials had decided 400 million would be used on monitoring. That's 40%. Now, the remaining 60%, 30% was going to repair the grader. So only 30% was going to go to the roads. And at what cost? 45 million per kilometer. So they were literally going to do about 87 kilometers in a year. This is a very critical district full of production. So he asked them, you guys, what are you going to monitor? Can't we use the existing monitoring system that you already had, so that we put this money in the roads? But also he inquired from other people, and they told him, in this area of yours, a kilometer goes for 12 million, not 45. That's the leadership. But without that leadership, people are going to do their things and won't get the values. So it's a critical thing Mr. Museveni highlights for us, that the population, because this has not touched the population, they are jittery. And I want to quote from the letter I've seen from the Ministry of Defense and Veteran Affairs, which was warning of people who are taking advantage of the vulnerability of the youth. Now, I have been doing risk assessment and analysis. And one of the things we have been told, don't look for the man walking with matchsticks. Ask your question, how did the grass dry? Because if there is no dry grass, this man with a matchstick would not raise a problem. So while we must get the guy with the matchstick who is inciting the vulnerable youth, you want to go back, how did the youth get vulnerable? And you'll find that evidence in Museveni's paper of April 2020, where he talks about the real economy and the vulnerable economy. So some of our policies have left the vulnerability to persist, and it's translating into a security situation. And he ends with number 8, which is partly to explain why the vulnerability has persisted, and I read it among the 10-point program, fighting corruption. If we don't fight corruption, the vulnerability will increase, and this dry grass can even be lit by nobody but lightning. And it doesn't know the level of advancement. If you know what happened to California, you know what I'm talking about. It can take anybody. So we need to resolve some of this. As I've said, restructuring. Vietnam, as we speak, is retrenching 100,000 employees because they can't find the money, and you can't compete with what you're supposed to do, and they just pay you salaries. Their precedents. Milei in Argentina has turned the country from a deficit of over 40 years into a surplus budget. They still have their debt, but at least now they can finance their budget on a day-to-day basis. Serious reforms, including withdrawal of subsidies. Nigeria, Lagos was full of traffic jams because of subsidized fuel. The current president simply says, no more subsidies. There were riots. They were handled, but alongside, the entire jam has disappeared. So what subsidies are we putting here that are not necessary? We are back to 1986. We need to look through and say, who are we subsidizing that cannot be sustained? So the conclusion is the Musevenomics agenda and the review of his policies and his practices really gives us some lessons to pick on. If we are to get inclusive development that will speak to the youth, we have some lessons that we can pick on. The Paris Development Model has come through. It is 7 pillars. I must emphasize this. It's not 1 pillar. It does not make sense to give somebody 1 million, they buy poultry or a goat, and there is no extension service provider in that village. And there is no functioning health facility in that village. I will sell the goat to treat my child. So when you come back, some of these genuinely will argue, will go to courts to write off. If you assess people and they really we failed them to succeed. The German economy is strong because you don't lend money and go and sit as a bank. You are part of that project. Before you foreclose, you've got to show what did you do to help the borrower succeed, you as a bank. Because this is the German economy. So you as a bank, you must participate in the German economy. That's why you make your profits. So the social market economy has made sure Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. It's not just because they are Germans. It's the policies the Germans have pursued. And I must say they were the first in 1948, the Minister of Finance in Germany used the terminology prosperity for all. The first time it was mentioned. And when they made vehicles, they made the smallest, the Beetle, so that they can make as many as possible. Prosperity for all. The Chinese we are seeing today, in 1960s, they did not have the bullet trains we are talking about. They had bicycles, and the bicycle was called China. It was the strongest. It was the most adored in Uganda. As a young boy, I wish I could have one. My father could not afford it. So I rode a hero. But this is where China has come from. Now I see people who want to be like China. You need to know that we are where China was in the 60s. I appreciate the standard gauge railway. But I'm more concerned, what are we going to take? I happened to be in the US one time with my friend and supervisor and boss, Professor Suruma. We were moving through the Silicon, Seattle, San Francisco area, and we were stopped by a train. For 45 minutes, the train was passing. Rails don't make money unless there is something moving on them. What was that rail track? Meter gauge. In the US, I've asked people, tell me where is a standard gauge railway section in the US. It's good to have them, but rationality, realism needs to come in. Ladies and gentlemen, Musevenomics is simply about that, and we can make the discussion. You have a right to give your opinion. That's why my paper is here with me, because I want to capture your opinions and include them in this paper. Mildred, tuhaiso Ruhang, come and take this over. If you don't know what tuhaise means, again, ask your neighbor. Professor Julius will not charge you for that. He's supposed to give that answer. Thank you for your kind attention.
I think Doctor deserves a bigger round of applause than that. Thank you very much for breaking it down. Almost 4 decades in less than 40 minutes. That was a very difficult task, but you handled it very, very diligently. And as Doctor did say, quite a lot that has happened over the time, but like he did say, it is an evolution. We are still discussing, and his paper is evolving, but very key amongst the issues that he did mention is the idea or the issue of evidence-based decision making. If you do not have the evidence, if you do not have the statistics that will be able to back your policy, that will be able to back the decision that you're taking, then it is as good as a bad decision to be able to take, or you're just thinking it out loud. But you also did mention one of the biggest issues or conversations that I and my colleagues in the media will always talk about, that is the issue of debt. I know if we are having any economic discussion, one of the conversations that will always come through is the issue of debt. And you highlighted as well the issue of domestic debt on the other hand. that while we are trying to ask people to work and join the money economy, if they get to supply government goods or services, are they able to receive the money so they can be able to plow it back? That's a very important discussion as well. And as we talk about import substitution and export promotion, Doctor did ask about what's the strategy on this export-led growth. So these are issues that we'll be pondering upon, and at a later stage we'll have a question and answer approach. But ladies and gentlemen, allow me invite our next speaker. I know that we are far behind schedule, but our next speaker is going to be speaking about a case study, which is an assessment of the major trends in Uganda's coffee sector. That cash crop which Doctor was talking about, because before you take that bag, there has to be some money that has to be given away. So what has been it about this coffee sector? And I'm privileged and honored to invite Professor Ezra Suruma to be able to take up this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Professor Ezra Suruma a round of applause as he comes to take us on the session.
Thank you very much, Madam Taise.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Honorable ministers and former ministers, Excellencies the ambassadors, honorable members of parliament, religious leaders. I think protocol is a bit difficult, you'll forgive me. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. I'm privileged to have an opportunity to present a case study on coffee. This is an area where I was involved, so I'm speaking on the basis of what I learned, of course, during the Museveni era starting in 1986. But I will also look back before that so that we have a clear contrast before 1986 and after 1986, so we can see the contribution which has been made in the Museveni era. My interpretation of Musevenomics is what has happened to the economy since he came into government as leader vis-a-vis how the economy was before. So I'm not theoretical, I'm simply looking at the two sides. And the economic background, I'll begin with the economic background to coffee reforms. Professor, or is it, I don't know, Dr. Muhumza, thank you very much for your presentation. You have touched on inflation, runaway inflation. This sounds like it's just a word. But if you were there in 1970s and 80s, inflation was not just a word, it was totally disruptive experience. You buy something today at 10,000 shillings. You say, but I bought it for 10,000 yesterday. You say, that was yesterday. Take it or leave it. So the inflation was very, very disruptive. Over 200%, some cases 300%. The shortages of commodities were very, very painful. There was nothing to buy. There was a lot of money. Everybody had money. Money was being carried in. We carried bags. You didn't carry money in your pocket because it would not be enough to buy anything. So we carried money in bags. And as somebody said about Germany, then we came back with goods in our pockets. So the shortages of very basic things like salt and sugar and soap, this is what the situation was in 80s and 70s. Government control of prices, including foreign exchange, was the government set prices for soda, set prices for sugar, set prices for salt, set prices for everything. Of course, I don't know how to put it, you set prices for things which are not there. So what good does it do? And of course, anyone who had those things would make sure that they don't sell them openly on the market. You'd have to go in a side place and buy at a much higher price than what the government had said. So the effect of government-controlled prices was to completely disrupt the economy. The coffee export was a monopoly, as Dr. Mhumza indicated, and many of you know. It was an export monopoly of Coffee Marketing Board. It had been so for a very long time. And those who lived in the 70s and 80s know the coffee was being smuggled to Rwanda and Kenya because the Coffee Marketing Board not only was it not paying the farmers cash, but their prices were also fixed and unfavorable. Infrastructure breakdown, roads, power, telephones, and so on, all controls on prices. This was dramatic. And then liberalization of foreign exchange. Some of you, when you go around with dollars and go to the bank and open a dollar bank account to withdraw dollars, you don't realize that before 1987, this would have been a crime. If you came in with the dollars at the airport, you had to declare, fill an exchange control form and declare the dollars you had come in with and surrender those dollars to central bank within 48 hours. And the central bank would buy them at the official price when the market price was much higher than you would get from the central bank. This was very painful. Many of us who came in with foreign exchange, we would under-declare. You have $100 in your pocket, you declare that you have 20. But then if they take you aside and search you and find that you have more than 20, they take the 80 for themselves. So we were suffering. It was very painful whenever you came to the airport having to decide to declare the foreign exchange. I visited many countries. I led a team. We visited many countries and came back and recommended the liberalization of foreign exchange. And the government adopted our recommendations. And I'm happy to say that that liberalization remains today. That was a fundamental change. Liberalization of coffee exports was difficult. Again, I led another team that visited many countries, Madagascar, Colombia, Costa Rica, and so on, to see how they were doing their coffee exporting. The World Bank and IMF put a lot of pressure on us. At first we resisted, but then the problem of crop finance became unbearable. Whenever it was time the coffee was in season, we had to come together with the commercial banks, with the central bank, with World Bank, and try and find out where to get money to give the Coffee Marketing Board to buy the coffee. This was called crop finance. And we couldn't find enough money. So, as you've heard, because the Coffee Marketing Board was not paying farmers, they started cutting down coffee trees. Since this was the only export we had at that time, we became very deeply alarmed, and we had to do something to solve the problem. And one of the solutions was to see how we could change the mechanism for export. So in 1990, we wrote a paper and recommended liberalization because they couldn't access finance. In 1996, I was chairman managing. 1993, chairman managing director of Uganda. A comparative. When I was at in 2010, I attempted to know how the liberalization of coffee exporting had affected our production and exports of coffee. And you'll see that in 1964 to 1970, that period, the average number of 60 kilogram bags, coffee exported in bags of 60 kilograms each. There were 2.8 million in that period. That was the average. In 71, 79, 2.7 million. So 3.5% reduction. Of course, 71, 79, this is the mini era. It was a difficult time. From 1980 to 89, there's a further reduction to 2.5 million on average per annum. And then I've put in red 1990 all the way to 2024. You'll see an increase between 1990 and 99. It's a 20% increase, which is quite dramatic. But during the early 2000s, I think this is when we have the coffee wilt, there was a reduction in production and the average came down to 2.8 million bags. But then from 2010 onwards, we have an increase of 37.3% and now 58.9%. So this is a dramatic increase in exports. Speaking now, the exportation is quite high. This is a graph showing the same figures I've just went through, so we can go on to the next graph. I attempted I was curious on the per capita coffee exports, and I think because of increase in population is much bigger than the increase apparently in coffee. So the per capita, the number of coffee exported per person on average has actually declined from around 20 bags per capita down to about 5, 6, 7 in the present era. That's just, I was just curious about that. I don't know how to interpret the significance of it. Next, households producing coffee have increased. Some of the numbers I got on households, I wasn't sure of them, especially in 1962. So I looked at, starting in 1985, when you have 0.6 million households producing coffee, and the figure now has gone to 1.8 million in 2024. So there's a considerable increase in the number of households who are benefiting from coffee production. Export values have, they were rather stable from 62, going up in the 70s. I think one year in 1970 went 558 million, or 558 million US dollars. But as you can see, the highest spike has come now with shooting over $1 billion for the first time at present. Next. This simply gives you a picture of the volatility in prices. The red curve is showing the extreme volatility in coffee prices. And I think the idea of a stabilization fund, which at least in colonial days was intended to stabilize prices so that coffee, whether the price went down or up, you'd continue to get a stable price, may not be a bad idea. I know when Dr. Mhumza was talking about it, he didn't think it was a good idea, but I think that as what's happening in tea industry now, for example, the tea sector is literally collapsing because of very low prices, and this volatility in prices is something we should look at. Now, how the dramatic rise in coffee production occurred, because we are supposed to be talking about Musevenomics, so we need to explain what happened. In October 2014, number one, the president issued a directive to increase coffee production to 20 million bags by 2020. This is from an average of 3 million bags over the previous 50 or 60 years. So I think I'm not surprised that the directive was issued in October 2014. I happened to be appointed as a head of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit in 2015. And the first order I received from the Prime Minister was this directive from the President to increase coffee production to 20 million bags by 2020. When it had been copied to the Minister of Agriculture, to the Minister of Finance, to the Vice President, everybody in government had received a copy of this directive. But when I looked around, by October 2015, 1 year later, nobody had done anything about it. So the Prime Minister gave it to me. It's my unit, the delivery unit. And we wondered what to do. We consulted around, and the Coffee Development Authority at that time said before they could tell nurseries to produce more seedlings, because the directive said we should distribute free seedlings of 300 million per annum for 3 years. And when we calculated the cost, I think it came to over $40 billion, if I remember well, additional money that was needed to pay for the seedlings. The Prime Minister called the Minister of Finance, and they said they didn't have the money. So we said, but there's a directive here. Said, but we don't have the money. Having been a Minister of Finance myself, I could sympathize with them. If you don't have the money, you don't have money. So the Prime Minister called them again, second time. They said, okay, we are going to look for the money. Then we kept quiet for a week or two. Then he called them again. And they said, okay, we'll look for the money. So when I was training on service delivery, we were told that prioritization is key to service delivery. And we found that when I met the permanent secretaries, they all said their areas were priorities, each one. So we said, well, we have, I don't know how many ministries. If every ministry is a priority, then there is no priority. And it was a big struggle. But eventually, I think we, of course, to distinguish between strong directives from the president and directives which are not too strong. This one was a strong directive. It could not be ignored. So we started to call in stakeholders with the help of some consultants, McKinsey and Company, came in to help us. And the stakeholder consultations were held between 2015 and 2017. This was research consulting stakeholders to learn what is actually on the ground. It was not academic. It's not reading books and statistics. It was consulting people who are in the sector. And following this, we were able to construct a roadmap, a coffee roadmap, to reach 20 million bags by 2030. But when we presented it to the president, he said, no, at least make it 5. We said, fine, we put at 2025, but in our calculations, we thought it could be done by 2030. But what I'm also hinting at here is that we involved the president in our efforts, in our prioritization and implementation. I think that one of the major lessons from this exercise is the problem of policy versus implementation. And what I'm telling you, I'm deliberately telling you this to show how we went about going from policy to implementation, and why I believe that we were successful. So in addition to the coffee roadmap, once we had the roadmap on how we are going to get to 20 million bags, we also had to have real-time monitoring. For example, real-time monitoring of seedlings distribution. The initial money that we gave out for seedlings, when we followed it up, I'm afraid to say how much of it was stolen. The seedlings were presumably produced, but nobody got them. And they were paid for. About 90% of them were not delivered. Sorry, 10% were not delivered. So we had to implement real-time monitoring, bring about a process of monitoring nationwide down to LC1. So unless you had dug holes and the holes were counted and then reported and signed by LC1 and LC2, and then the report sent to the district, then that would determine how many seedlings would be distributed in that area. But without it, we would not distribute the seedlings. Lessons from the Coffee Roadmap of 2017. One lesson, I believe that's very important in Musevenomics, is the importance of target setting. And I think the president has done very well in this area. 20 million bags by 2020 seemed like a dream, but it's like, I think Kennedy announcing that Americans are going to go to the moon. You know, I don't think they knew how to go there, but they said we are going there. And eventually they got there. So setting targets, quantitative targets is very important. I already mentioned but prioritization, thank you. Prioritization involving the head of state, because at other levels, the priorities tend to be ignored. 3, the stakeholders lab, as it was called, bringing together all the stakeholders in the coffee sector for 1 week at Chigo was very important for us in determining the roadmap, a realistic roadmap, and we learned the distinct. I'm a professor, but I learned the difference between speaking theoretically and speaking from people who have first-hand knowledge. People who are transporting coffee, who are processing coffee, who are growing coffee. Talking to them is different from reading books and saying, this is what is going on. So I believe that the roadmap we put together remains an important document to guide the future of the industry. Pressure for results, especially on the seedlings financing. I've already covered that, so we can go to the next. Continuing with the lessons, liberalization of price controls and exchange controls are essential to continued growth, and especially crop finance. I think that what has been done in the coffee sector would not have been possible in an environment of price controls and export controls. So I hope that this environment of freedom in prices, setting prices and so on will continue to be there. Crop finance continues to be difficult, especially those who are trying to export. It's a very, very painful and expensive process. And I think we have a long way to go, especially for Ugandans to be a significant part of this sector, because currently are dominating that sector. So I want to disagree with Mr. Muhumuza here when he said the central bank should not concern itself with credit. Mr. Nwagaba, please, I'm an exporter. We need money for export, and it's constraining us, and we are being driven out of the sector. So please find ways of helping us so that we can also continue, but not only continue, but also grow in that sector. Why should we leave it to foreigners? Ugandans also need to participate in it. Finally, a concept of structured demand. It underlies coffee expansion, because without market there will be no growth. So as a part of the roadmap, we had to do a global market research. And we were confident that it was okay to encourage the farmers to increase the coffee production because the market for coffee was growing. We didn't want to repeat the double production campaign of Idi Amin in the 1970s. It's a double production, you double production, then there is no market. So we did a study of the global market, and we felt that as we increase coffee production, we don't have to worry about finding a market for the product. So that roadmap is based on this fundamental knowledge that the world market for coffee is growing. And indeed, as I speak, the prices are quite high. Thank you very much. That's what has happened in the coffee sector during President Museveni's period. There's definitely a dramatic increase in coffee production and the number of households benefiting from it. I'm sure there's room for improvement, but there's no doubt that his targeting for 20 million bags has resulted in a dramatic increase that had not occurred in any decade since 1964. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ezra, and let's give him a bigger round of applause. I did hear from one of his neighbors thanking him for provoking so many questions, and I think I totally agree with that. We're going to switch up our program just a little bit to make some adjustments, but I'll be communicating that later on. Talking about the coffee sector, if I asked how many of us here have at least been convinced to plant some coffee in the recent past? Let me just see your hands. I think, Prof, you can see clearly, including myself, because I vested myself more, at least on the production of the seedlings end. But when you talked about seedlings, especially when you were complaining about just how much money has been lost, my bigger thinking was also about the quality of seedlings that are produced. That's one of the biggest problem. Because there is a boom, because there is markets, there is a little bit of a problem with how many nurseries are certified to produce what quality of seedlings. So while some of the nurseries will be visited by the National Coffee Research Institute, and you have all these seedlings coming through, you're being trained on what to do, there is another person who is looking at getting it the easy way. So they'll do whatever they have to do and produce whatever kind of seedlings they do and cash in on them. So while we are looking at that coffee roadmap, I think the issues of quality come in very handy, but also the issues of payment for the supplies that do come through. Because as a nursery farmer, I know that there are quite a number of other nursery farmers who have also complained about that. So while I loved when Dr. Mhumza talked about the holistic view of looking at this entire conversation. The roadmap is ideal. It's very great. We're looking at these monies and they're definitely going to come through. But can we also start from the beginning all the way to the end? I think that is going to be a very, very good conversation. And in our Q&A that will be coming through, chaired by Mami, I call her Mami, Dr. Victoria Sech-Toleko, I think a lot of these conversations are going to be coming in. So ladies and gentlemen, we've been seated for quite a bit. Health is very important. I always remind ourselves. Your back is very important for you because it does have your spinal. So I'm going to allow us to do a little bit of a movement as we have our coffee break. But shortly before we go for the coffee break, because we were supposed to be having our opening ceremony and we are still just getting the two special guests on, I beg your pardon, on our opening ceremony ready. So we'll have our coffee break and have the opening ceremony immediately after, and then go into the session that we were also supposed to have. But just before we do that, I am going to request for our partners, I am going to request the front tables here, including our EU partners, to be able to come through. The UDF, Uganda Development Corporation, I do see the Private Sector Foundation, Uganda, as well as all our partners, to please, Professor Ezra and the entire table right there, to please come to the front so we can have a group picture, because most of this we definitely need the memories coming through. I do see the Vice Chairperson of the Uganda Development Forum, who is also the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs. I am kindly requesting that as I do get to mention all these names, Dr. Virunji, Uganda Development Corporation, let's get here. Yes, the Deputy, yes, let's get the Deputy Governor, let's get to the front and have this memory, because then we'll be able to say that as we discussed at the Musevenomics Conference, these are the ideas that came up, and this is what we agreed. This is what we've been able to do, because that's also the kind of assessment that we are having right now. That what was it before? What have we worked on? What have we tried to deal with? What has failed? Okay, not failed. What is still challenging? What is still working? That's a bit for us to be able to. And since we have some steps, we will extend forward. So some will get to the lower steps and some will remain right up. Okay. And as we have this photo moment, during our coffee break, I know we do have some ushers who are going to help us. We're going to have our order of march. I am getting a bit military in a way. So our order of march will be that the very people who are right here taking the photo, plus all those at the front side, we will be taking our breakfast at the Kazinga Channel restaurant, and our ushers will be able to lead us there. And then much later on, we will also have the ushers allowing the rest of us to get to our side where we will have our coffee break. And I'm going to request that we keep it brief and precise. It was meant to be 30 minutes, but I'm going to request that we will use 20 minutes exactly, so we can be able to deal with our coffee break. So ladies and gentlemen, I will request our ushering team to come and lead our guests at the high tables, at the reserved tables, to the coffee break. We're going to take exactly 20 minutes. Feel free to bring your coffee here and have it right here if you do not want to stay a little bit longer, because we're trying to manage time, having lost a bit of time. So I'm going to request our DJ to give us some soothing music as we go for the coffee break. The ushers will be leading our guests, and then when we do come through, we'll be engaging in our panels, and we'll also be engaging in the other discussion on value addition, on industrialization, but also we'll be having some brief testimonials later on from the private sector. Thank you so much, and I think also this will be the time that the media can be able to use to take some brief interviews if you need to, for as long as I can be able to have the guests back in the next 20 minutes. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Let's continue with the interaction, because that's the reason why we're here, to exchange ideas, to exchange knowledge, and be able to interact. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And thank you so much for getting back. In most cases, when you let people go for a break, there's a tendency that you may lose a good number of them. But we want to thank you so much for getting back, and we'll be getting into our next session. So I'm going to request kindly that we all get settled to listen to our next speakers. And also at a later stage, we'll also be having our opening session before we go for lunch. We want to manage time. I know that we've lost quite a lot of it, and we are not too far away from our lunch break as well. So we want to manage the time as much as possible. So, right, for those who just joined us probably during our break, our earlier session was basically looking at the evolution of the Musevenomics, looking at the policies that have been in place since 1986, which was done justice elaborately by Dr. Fred Muhumuza, and he did mention quite a lot. I know that we were noting down, and during the time of the Q&A, we will also be able to ask questions as well. But we also did, before we went for the break, Ebli, Professor Ezra Ruma, did take us through the case study of the assessment of the major trends in Uganda's coffee sector. And when I did ask across the room how many people are currently engaged in coffee, I think I did get more than half the room, which is a very, very interesting one. And I want to believe that you also have a number of issues in that same sector that you would want addressed, and we'll be looking at that. So without wasting any more time, before I invite Honorable Victoria Sechitoleko, who will be chairing one of our sessions, allow me invite a presentation on the case for value addition and industrialization, because during COVID-19, government did take a strong stance on not only speaking for industrialization, but ensuring that everything else does speak to that. Because even when we look at our tenfold growth strategy, agro-industrialization is very key. And that also does speak to import substitution and export promotion, which earlier on Dr. Muhumuza also did say, what is the strategy that we do have as we think about exports. So Dr. Patrick Birungi, the Executive Director of the Uganda Development Corporation, will be speaking to us about the aspect of value addition as well as industrialization. So ladies and gentlemen, as we get settled, please, let's invite Dr. Birungi with a round of applause. And immediately after his presentation, we'll have Honorable Sechitoleko chairing a panel, an expert panel discussion, whereafter we'll now engage in the actual reason as to why we're here, and that is being able to brainstorm. Dr. Birungi, welcome once again. We didn't give him enough energy. Let's welcome him with a thunderous round of applause.
Thank you, Mildred. I think no more need for further introduction. The only thing I can add, I'm an economist. I only need to start by warning you. Circumstances are not always the same way, and therefore we need some bit of intervention, and therefore we need to come up with resolutions out of this meeting that are concrete, other than resolutions that are contradictory. I've been asked to talk about a case of value addition and industrialization. As UDC, that is our work. That's where we play a key role. And I will explain this a little more and how we come in. I will build on the protocol that had earlier on been communicated by the Master of Ceremonies. So I will start by contributing to that understanding. Spend a few minutes because Dr. Muhumuza has really done justice to this topic. But what I wanted to bring out clearly is that what is the end game of the whole ideology and strategy around Musevenomics? Some of those people who are senior to us here know more about the 10-point program. And by that time, of those 10 points, point number 5 emphasized having an integrated, independent, and self-sustaining economy. Throughout my discussion, you will see that the aim, the ultimate aim, is having that integrated, independent, and self-sustaining economy. So on this slide, you'll see the far end. I guess it's to your right, the far end to my left. The impact of Musevenomics is about having that integrated, independent, and self-sustaining economy. We've looked through a series of speeches by His Excellency the President over the years and tried to look at what are those key pillars in his communication. And the key pillars or key fundamentals are the ones that begin on my right, on your left. It's about awakening the sleeping peasants so that they can join the money economy. We'll have a whole session tomorrow to discuss that. It's about fostering value addition. This is the session on that. It's about low cost of doing business. I think there is a section to that this afternoon. Land consolidation and tenure security. Because of the 2 days, I guess we could not have detailed discussion on all of them. But we'll have a discussion on economics and political integration tomorrow as well. But there are many other key foundations: private sector led development, security of persons and property, and so on and so forth. And you remember a time when all of us would run to the TVs during COVID because the president is going to address the nation. And at that time, one of the key papers that came out was the paper on the real economy versus vulnerable economy. I'm sure you remember that, because at that time everyone listened to TV. And then we waited for that key phrase or key word, therefore. And at that time, the president wrote this paper to say that if your economy is heavily dependent on the vulnerable sectors, then that economy will get a shock anytime and it will go down. And he emphasized the need to have a key fundamentals of the real economy. And he emphasized production and productivity, industry and value addition. He emphasized value addition, and he says we are going to transform Uganda's raw materials, whether agriculture, minerals, or others, into high quality products. Produce those medicines here. We shall produce those gloves here. We shall produce, and so on and so forth. So I will briefly talk about the historical context and foundations of a ginning facility in Soroti, tea processing in Metiana, and so on and so forth. It was the beginning of a different era of industrialization. Doesn't mean we're not mining ore to produce ores. We had our own kind of ores, but to produce them massively, to produce them on an industrial scale, was something that was introduced in this country by the British governments. At that time, there was the introduction of the 3 C's and the 3 T's. The coffee, cotton, and copper, the tea, tobacco, and tourism at that time. And these were introduced as cash crops, cash commodities, where we got money from. We exported them with minimum value addition or no value addition at all. So the best we could do in industrialization at the time is packaging industrialization. So you get the cotton seed, remove the seeds, and package it or bale it and export. Today, we are still doing a lot of that. But if you look at the old national development plans in the 1960s, you'll still find that those development plans were talking about manufacturing and agro-value addition. So the big change or game changer happens in 1952 when 2 key institutions were established in this country, and that is the Uganda Electricity Board and the Uganda Development Corporation. So this was a game changer. The game changer was now a move towards encouraging industrialization. UEB was brought in place to make sure that we have power generation, distribution, and management. UDC, on the other hand, was brought in place to utilize that power, but also to propagate that industrialization agenda in the country. As a result of the introduction of UDC, with an investment of about £5 million at the time, we saw a lot of investments happening in this space. In the first 2 decades of its existence, UDC was at the center of development of this country. Dr. Muhumza talked about Coffee Marketing Board, but there was a bigger institution called UDC at that time. There are so many industries that were established. If you go in the agriculture space, the Uganda Grain Milling Company, the Agriculture Enterprises Limited, that led to the establishments of those tea factories in Kienjojo, Fort Potro, Kanungu, and so on. Tafmark, the livestock industries. I guess it's only the table where Professor Kamuntu is seated that is following me at this moment. Because they lived this period, they know what this meant for the country. Whether it is in metals, the Steel Corporation of Uganda, Tampeco, and so on. Whether it is in minerals, the Kilembe mines, Uganda Cement, which established Tororo and Hima cement factories, partly related to the goal of UEB at the time to try and provide cement for construction of the Owen Falls Dam. All these things was, that this is where the game changer of industrialization actually took place. In chemicals, again, we had so many other chemical industries. In textiles, Nyaitil, for example, all these companies were started by UDC at the time in cooperation with the Commonwealth Development Corporation, CDC, of UK at that time. Today it's called BII, British International Investment, something like that. It was in the banking sector. If you talk about DFCU today, these financial institutions were established by UDC of that day. And the financial institutions, UGADEV, which transformed into UDB in 1972, were all started with the aim of financing the development goal of UDC at that time. And where UDC was also in the hospitality sector. I remember among the 3 T's there was tourism, and therefore there had to be tourism infrastructure across the whole country. And if you know what used to be called the Uganda hotels, in all these major towns, there was a Uganda hotel, whether it is in Jinja, in Soroti, in Moroto Inn, in Acholi Inn, all over the country. So, by that time, UDC was contributing about 33% of the country's total revenue through taxation, and was the second largest employer with an employment of employing about, with its subsidiaries, employing about 24,000 people, second only to public service. Public service had the army, the teachers, the health workers, and so on and so forth. So it was really the center of economic development. I'll leave the details to those people who were there at that time to tell us later on in the discussion. At independence in 1962, the structure was largely agrarian. 50% of GDP was agriculture. Manufacturing and electricity and so on was about 25%. Then trade, commerce was about 15%, and public administration about 11%. When we looked at the manufacturing snapshot at that time, we were more into cotton ginning, coffee, and so on and so forth. But we also had cotton, establishment of Nyanza textiles that I talked about, and later on the Kilembe mines and so on and so forth. The country was relatively stable from the macroeconomic point of view, but the population growth was still around 2.93% throughout at that time. We had very positive growth over those years. The 70s up to 86, we saw a collapse of most of our economy, emanating from the policy driver at the time, a move to the east. So we saw industrial bases collapsing. We saw a number of private sector-led institutions taken into government, thrown into UDC. Coupled with the wars that followed, these institutions could not sustain their profitability and performance in the years that followed. So the liberalization that Professor Solomon talked about and Dr. Mahomes also talked about found fertile ground, because these were institutions that were pulling resources from the treasury. So it found fertile ground for liberalization to take root and drive the agenda of the time. My colleagues have talked about the macroeconomic instability at that time. Inflation beyond 200%. And later on I will tell you, for the last 3 or 4, almost 4 decades, inflation has been contained to below 5%, save for the years of post-COVID and the impacts of that. So the concentration of the leadership at the time was more on restoring security and rule of law, return assets to the private sector. Remember, private sector led was a key fundamental in this discussion, and revival of basic manufacturing activities. The Washington Consensus, when we went liberalization and privatization, I guess Washington Consensus means these policies were enshrined in the World Bank, IMF thinking, and therefore direction to the developing countries. So we went to structure adjustment programs. Honorable Mao and I had some strikes at the university, particularly to resist some of the structure adjustment programs, especially when they touched our boom. Those who were there at the time know what boom means or meant to us. So we used to get those allowances for books, for whatever, and then under structure adjustment programs, they say financing higher education, reduce the cost, and then try to finance more primary education. And that led to a bit of challenges. But yes, we did resist. We may not have achieved all the goals, but I think we did our best. So when it came to liberalization era, the question was, if you are told to liberalize, are you told to open the door so that you can allow the private